I stood in the marble lobby of Sunset Manor, watching my daughter Rebecca sign the admission papers while my son Michael counted out cash for the first month's payment. Neither of them looked at me. The facility smelled like industrial disinfectant and artificial vanilla, a combination that made my stomach turn. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the manicured gardens where other residents shuffled along concrete paths, some in wheelchairs, others leaning heavily on walkers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mom, you're going to love it here, Rebecca said, without turning around, her voice bright and hollow. They have bingo on Tuesdays and movie nights on Fridays. She was wearing the same navy blazer she wore to business meetings, the one that made her look older than her 42 years. Michael nodded along, adjusting his tie nervously. He looked uncomfortable but not guilty, just eager to leave. Wasn't dying. I wasn't even sick. I was 73 years old with perfectly functioning legs, a sharp mind, and enough energy to tend my garden every morning before sunrise. But 3 weeks ago, Rebecca had sat me down in my own kitchen and explained with spreadsheets and printed emails why this was the best decision for everyone involved. Michael had stood behind her, hands clasped, like a bodyguard protecting her from my potential objections. The real reason wasn't my health. It was my house. The 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Street that I'd called home for 47 years. The one with the wraparound porch and the oak tree I'd planted when Rebecca was born. The house that had somehow become worth $2 million, according to the latest property assessment. The house they needed me to sell so they could split. The inheritance while I was still alive to sign the papers. When I first held Rebecca in the hospital nursery, her tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb, I never imagined she'd grow up to measure my worth in square footage and market value. When Michael took his first steps across the hardwood floors of that same house, stumbling into my arms with a gap-toothed grin, I never thought those floors would become a commodity to him. I was Dorothy Chen, and for most of my life, I'd been exactly who I was supposed to be. I married young to James Chen, a gentleman who sold insurance and never missed a Sunday service. We bought the house on Maple Street in 1977 when Rebecca was 2, and Michael was still growing inside me. The neighborhood was modest then, filled with young families and old maple trees that dropped their leaves like golden confetti every October. James and I painted every room ourselves. We chose soft yellow for Rebecca's bedroom because we wanted something cheerful, and pale blue for Michael's room because James insisted our son would need calm colors. The kitchen was cream with cherry wood cabinets that James installed himself, working evenings and weekends until his hands were permanently stained with wood polish. We planted roses along the front fence and built a small vegetable garden in the backyard where the children would help me pick tomatoes every summer. Those early years felt like living inside a warm embrace. James would come home from work smelling like coffee and paperwork, and I'd have dinner waiting. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I loved the ritual of it, the way Rebecca would set the table with mismatched dishes we'd collected from garage sales, the way Michael would steal pieces of carrots while I chopped vegetables, thinking I didn't notice. Sundays were our sacred time. We'd attend morning service at St. Matthew's, then come home for a big lunch that usually lasted until mid-afternoon. James would read the newspaper aloud while I did the dishes, and the children would sprawl on the living room floor with coloring, books, and puzzles. Sometimes we'd take drives to nowhere in particular, just to see the countryside change with the seasons. When Rebecca turned 16, she announced she wanted to be a lawyer. She was fierce about it, already wearing business-appropriate clothes to school and talking about college applications with the intensity of a military strategist. James and I were proud, if a little bewildered. Neither of us had college degrees. I'd finished high school and gone straight to work at the local bank, and James had learned insurance from his father. Michael was quieter, more thoughtful. He loved mathematics and spent hours in his room working through algebra problems for fun. When he was 14, he built a computer from spare parts he'd ordered through mail catalogs, and James and I stood in his doorway watching him type commands we couldn't understand, feeling like we were witnessing magic. Both children were brilliant, driven, ambitious in ways that sometimes made me feel small, but I was proud of their hunger for something bigger than our little house on Maple Street. I worked extra shifts at the bank to help pay for Rebecca's law school applications. James took on weekend clients to cover Michael's computer science textbooks. We ate a lot of pasta and beans those years, but we never complained. Rebecca graduated from law school third in her class and immediately got hired at a prestigious firm downtown. She moved to a sleek apartment in the city center and started wearing expensive suits that made her look like someone I'd see on television. Michael got his engineering degree and landed a job at a tech company that paid him more in his first year than James made in 3. They were successful. They were everything we'd hoped they'd become. But somewhere in their climb toward achievement, they'd stopped looking back at the people who'd lifted them up. James died suddenly when I was 68. Heart attack on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. One moment he was commenting on the weather forecast, the next moment he was gone. Rebecca flew in from a business trip in Chicago. Michael drove down from his new house in the suburbs. They stayed for the funeral, helped me sort through James's papers, and assured me they'd visit more often. They didn't. Rebecca called every few weeks, but the conversations were brief and focused on practical matters. Was I keeping up with the house maintenance? Did I need help with finances? Was I eating properly? She never asked how I was sleeping, in the bed I'd shared with James for 43 years, or whether I missed having someone to read the newspaper to. Michael was even more distant. He'd send text messages on holidays and birthdays, brief notes that felt like obligations fulfilled. When I called him directly, he always seemed distracted, typing in the background or having side conversations with his wife Linda. The house began to feel enormous. Rooms that had once bustled with family dinners and homework sessions and weekend projects now echoed with my footsteps. I kept everything exactly as it had been when James was alive. His coffee cup still sat in the cabinet where he'd left it. His reading glasses remained folded on the nightstand. The workshop in the basement stayed locked because I couldn't bear to see his unfinished projects. I thought about selling, especially after the first real estate agent knocked on my door. The neighborhood had changed dramatically. Young professionals were buying up the old family homes, tearing them down, and building modern monuments to their success. My little colonial with its imperfect paint and decades-old appliances looked quaint by comparison, but apparently that was exactly what buyers wanted. The agent, an energetic woman named Patricia with perfectly white teeth, walked through my house like she was conducting an appraisal. She pointed out the original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures with the enthusiasm of someone discovering buried treasure. When she told me the estimated value, I laughed out loud. $2 million for a house James and I had bought for $38,000. But I wasn't ready to leave. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This house held every important memory of my life. Rebecca's first word, spoken while she sat in her high chair in the kitchen. Michael's high school graduation party in the backyard. The Christmas mornings when the living room was buried in wrapping paper and the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the air. James's last birthday, when we'd sat on the front porch swing and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Instead of selling, I stayed. I learned to live with the silence. I joined a book club at the library and volunteered at the community center. I maintained the garden because it gave me purpose, and I kept the house clean because it gave me routine. I wasn't lonely exactly. I was just alone. Then the neighborhood started changing more rapidly. The old Murphy house sold to a young couple who immediately started construction on a massive addition. The Williams family moved to Florida, and their house was demolished within a month, replaced by a glass and steel structure that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Property values soared. Property taxes followed. Rebecca started mentioning the house more frequently during our phone calls. She'd read articles about the real estate market in my area, she said. She was concerned about me maintaining such a large property. Wouldn't I be more comfortable somewhere smaller, more manageable? Somewhere with people my own age? Michael joined these conversations, adding his voice to Rebecca's gentle pressure. They worried about me living alone, they said. What if I fell? What if there was an emergency? What if the house became too much for me to handle? I understood what they were really saying. They wanted their inheritance while they could still enjoy it. Rebecca was paying off law school loans and saving for her daughter's private school tuition. Michael had just bought a house that was twice the size of mine and needed money for renovations. The responsible thing, the smart thing, would be for me to sell the house and move somewhere more appropriate for a woman my age. The first time Rebecca mentioned Sunset Manor, she presented it like a vacation brochure. The facility offered assisted living for seniors who wanted independence with the security of on-site care. They had their own apartments, restaurant style, dining, social activities, transportation services. It wasn't a nursing home, she emphasized. It was a community. Michael agreed enthusiastically. Linda had a grandmother who lived in a similar place and loved it, he said. She'd made friends, joined clubs, felt more engaged than she had in years. They weren't trying to get rid of me, they insisted. They were trying to help me find a better quality of life. I visited Sunset Manor on a gray Thursday afternoon. The lobby was impressive, all marble and chandeliers and fresh flower arrangements. The staff was friendly and professional. The apartments were clean and well-appointed, with small kitchenettes and private bathrooms. The residents I met seemed content, if not exactly vibrant. But it wasn't home. The walls were beige and generic. The furniture was designed for function, not comfort. The windows looked out on manicured lawns that stretched to a tall fence topped with decorative iron spikes. It was beautiful in the way a hotel is beautiful, but it felt temporary, like a place to wait for something else to happen. Rebecca was thrilled when I told her I'd consider it. She immediately started researching the admission process and touring the facility herself. Michael offered to help me sort through my belongings and decide what to keep. They were both so enthusiastic about my potential new life that I began to feel guilty for hesitating. The pressure increased gradually. Rebecca would call with updates about wait lists and availability. Michael would send me articles about seniors who'd thrived after making similar transitions. They never directly demanded that I move, but their expectations hung in the air like smoke. Then came the meeting in my kitchen 3 weeks ago. Rebecca arrived with a folder full of documents and a determined expression I remembered from her childhood when she'd set her mind on something. Michael sat beside her, nodding at appropriate intervals like a supportive co-counsel. They'd done research, Rebecca explained. Sunset Manor had an immediate opening, which was rare. The real estate market in my neighborhood was at its peak, which meant I could get the best possible price for the house. The timing was perfect. Michael added that they'd already spoken to a financial advisor about how to manage the proceeds from the sale. They could invest the money conservatively to ensure I'd have enough for care expenses for the rest of my life, with a substantial amount left over for their own families. It was all very logical, very well planned, very considerate of everyone involved. Except for the part where they asked what I wanted. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where James had read me the newspaper every Sunday for 40 years, and listened to my children explain why I needed to give up everything, familiar and precious, so they could inherit their money while they were young enough to enjoy it. They spoke about market conditions and care quality and social opportunities. They showed me brochures and financial projections and testimonials from satisfied families. They never once asked if I wanted to leave the house where I'd raised them, loved them, sacrificed for them. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady but quiet. When do you need an answer? Rebecca glanced at Michael, then back at me. Well, we can't hold the spot at Sunset Manor indefinitely, and the realtor thinks we should list the house as soon as possible to take advantage of the current market. How soon? 2 weeks, Michael said. 3 at the most. I nodded. Slowly, looking around the kitchen that had been the heart of my family for nearly half a century, the cherry wood cabinets James had installed, the window over the sink where I'd watched my children play in the backyard, the corner where we'd measured their heights on the wall, marking their growth in pencil lines that were now painted over, but still visible if you knew where to look. I'll think about it, I said. That night, I sat on the front porch swing and watched the neighborhood settle into evening. Lights came on in windows, families gathered around dinner tables, children played in yards while their parents called them in for baths and bedtime stories. I thought about James, about the dreams we'd shared for our children's futures. We'd wanted them to be successful, independent, capable of building good lives for themselves. We'd never imagined that success would make them view their parents as obstacles to be managed, problems to be solved, assets to be liquidated. But I also thought about something else. Something Rebecca and Michael didn't know, had never bothered to ask about, had never shown interest in understanding. During the 5 years since James died, while I'd been living alone in our family home, I hadn't been idle. I'd been learning, reading, investigating, planning. The modest woman who'd worked at the local bank for 30 years, who'd painted rooms and planted gardens and packed school lunches, had been quietly educating herself about investments, real estate, market trends, and financial strategy. I'd taken online courses in business management. I'd studied property law. I'd researched tax implications and inheritance structures and legal frameworks. I'd consulted with advisors Rebecca and Michael didn't know existed, because unlike my children, I hadn't spent the years after James's death assuming someone else would take care of me. I'd been taking care of myself. 2 days later, I called Rebecca and told her I'd accept the spot at Sunset Manor. She was so relieved and excited that she immediately began making arrangements. Michael offered to take time off work to help with the move. They were both so pleased with my decision that they didn't notice I'd never actually agreed to sell the house. Not yet, anyway. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of packing and planning and paperwork. Rebecca and Michael threw themselves into the process of transitioning me to my new life with the efficiency of project managers closing a major deal. They sorted through my belongings, deciding what would fit in my new apartment and what should be donated or stored. I let them organize everything. I smiled and nodded and expressed gratitude for their help. I even allowed myself to seem a little overwhelmed by the complexity of it all, a little dependent on their guidance and expertise. But in the quiet moments, when they were busy with boxes and phone calls, I was making my own arrangements. I was putting pieces in place for something they couldn't imagine, something that would shift the balance of power so completely that they'd never see me as a fragile old woman who needed their management again. The morning of my move to Sunset Manor, Rebecca and Michael loaded my selected possessions into a moving truck while I took one final walk through the empty house. I ran my fingers along the kitchen counters, stood in the doorway of the children's bedrooms, and said goodbye to the walls that had sheltered my family for 47 years. But it wasn't really goodbye. Because in 6 months, when my plan came to fruition, I'd be back. Not as the woman who'd raised Rebecca and Michael in these rooms, as the woman who owned the building where they lived. That was the twist they'd never see coming. The mother they'd dismissed as a sweet, simple burden had been playing a much longer, much more sophisticated game than either of them could have imagined. And soon, very soon, they were going to learn exactly what kind of woman I'd become in the years they'd been too busy to notice. The first night at Sunset Manor, I lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling tiles and listening to sounds I'd never heard before. The hum of industrial air conditioning, footsteps in the hallway at all hours, the distant beeping of medical equipment. Somewhere down the corridor, a woman was crying softly, a sound that seemed to seep through the walls and settle in my chest like a weight. My new apartment was pleasant enough. The walls were painted a soothing sage green, and the furniture was well made if impersonal. There was a small sitting area with a beige loveseat and matching armchair, a kitchenette with a compact refrigerator and microwave, and a bedroom just large enough for the single bed and dresser. The bathroom was designed for safety, with grab, bars, and a walk-in shower that made me feel older just looking at it. Rebecca had decorated the space with photos from home, thinking it would help me adjust. Pictures of family gatherings, graduations, holidays. But seeing those familiar faces in this sterile environment only emphasized how far I was from the life I'd built. The images looked foreign here, like artifacts from someone else's existence. The morning routine at Sunset Manor began at 6:30, with gentle knocking on doors and cheerful announcements about breakfast service. I dressed slowly, choosing clothes from the limited wardrobe that had survived Rebecca's ruthless editing process. She'd insisted I wouldn't need many outfits in my new lifestyle, focusing on comfort over style. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw exactly what she'd intended. A harmless elderly woman who'd surrendered control of her life to more capable hands. The dining room buzzed with quiet conversation and the clink of silverware against dishes. Round tables seated 6 residents each, and I was assigned to table 4 with Martha, a former teacher who'd lost her husband the previous year. Harold, a retired engineer who spent most meals explaining mechanical processes no one asked about. Eleanor, who'd been a secretary at an insurance company and still dressed for the office every day. Robert, a gentle man who rarely spoke but smiled kindly at everyone. And Patricia, who complained about everything with such consistency that the others had learned to tune her out entirely. They were nice people, pleasant company, but they shared a quality that made my skin crawl. They'd all accepted this place as their final destination. They spoke about their previous lives in past tense, as if those identities had been filed away with their independence. They discussed their children's visits with the gratitude of recipients rather than the authority of parents who'd raised and sacrificed for those same children. Martha showed me pictures of her daughter's new kitchen renovation, paid for with money from the sale of Martha's house. Eleanor mentioned that her son had finally taken that European vacation he'd always dreamed of, made possible by her downsizing. Harold explained how his daughter's family had moved into a larger home in a better school district, thanks to his contribution to their down payment. They all spoke as if their reduced circumstances were natural progressions, inevitable consequences, of aging rather than choices made by families who'd prioritized their own comfort over their parents' autonomy. I listened to their stories and felt something cold and sharp growing in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. After breakfast, I attended the orientation session for new residents. The activities director, an energetic woman named Susan, who spoke in exclamation points, explained the weekly schedule with the enthusiasm of a camp counselor. Mondays were craft time. Tuesdays brought bingo and book club. Wednesdays featured exercise class and gardening. Thursdays offered cooking demonstrations and card games. Fridays were movie nights. Weekends included religious services and family visiting hours. It was a full schedule designed to keep us busy, engaged, and grateful. But it was also a schedule designed for people who no longer had real responsibilities, real power, real influence over their own lives. Every activity was supervised. Every meal was prepared. Every decision was filtered through staff members who treated us with the kind of patronizing kindness usually reserved for children. I signed up for everything Susan recommended, smiled, at all the appropriate moments, and asked questions that suggested I was eager to integrate into this community. But internally, I was calculating timing, resources, opportunities. Because unlike my table mates, I hadn't surrendered anything. I'd simply relocated my base of operations. Rebecca called that first evening, her voice bright with forced cheer. How was my first day? Was I settling in well? Had I made any friends? She spoke to me the way she might address a child on their first day of school, and I responded with the appropriate level of gratitude and mild anxiety. I told her about my table mates, mentioned Susan's enthusiasm, described the view from my window overlooking the gardens. I kept my voice soft, a little uncertain, exactly what she expected from a woman who'd just made a major life transition. What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent the afternoon in the business center, using the computers and internet access to check on investments I'd been quietly building for the past 5 years, or that I'd scheduled a conference call with my financial advisor for the following morning, or that I'd already begun researching the ownership structure of the apartment building where she and Michael both lived. Rebecca lived on the 14th floor of Harbor View Towers, a luxury high-rise in the downtown district. Michael and Linda owned a unit on the 10th floor of the same building. They'd chosen the location for its convenience to their offices and its prestige address. The building offered amenities they'd bragged about during family dinners: a fitness center, rooftop terrace, concierge service, and panoramic views of the city skyline. They'd both purchased their units during the market downturn 6 years earlier, when prices were at their lowest. Rebecca had stretched her finances to afford the monthly payments, but she'd viewed it as an investment in her professional image. Michael had been more conservative, buying a smaller unit, but Linda had insisted on the building's reputation and location. Now, with the real estate market reaching new heights, their apartments had appreciated significantly. They felt wealthy, successful, secure in their choices. They hosted dinner parties and business meetings in their elegant spaces, collected compliments on their sophisticated taste, and basked in the admiration of friends who envied their lifestyle. What they didn't know was that Harbor View Towers was owned by a corporation that had been struggling financially for the past 2 years. The management company had been cutting costs, deferring maintenance, and searching desperately for a buyer who could inject capital into the operation. The beautiful facade was hiding serious structural issues, outdated systems, and mounting debts. I'd learned all of this during my months of research, back when I was supposed to be a lonely widow tending her garden and waiting for her children to visit. While Rebecca and Michael were building their careers and assuming I was simply existing in my old house, I'd been studying business reports, analyzing market trends, and developing a comprehensive understanding of real estate investment strategies. My education hadn't stopped with online courses. I'd consulted with lawyers who specialized in property acquisition. I'd met with accountants who understood tax implications. I'd spoken with construction managers who could assess building conditions and renovation costs. I'd built a network of professionals who took me seriously because I asked intelligent questions and paid their fees promptly. The sale of my house would generate approximately $2 million, minus taxes and fees. That was more than enough to purchase Harbor View Towers, assuming I could negotiate favorable terms with the desperate ownership corporation. The building had 240 units, generating rental income that would more than cover operating expenses once I'd addressed the maintenance issues. But money was only part of my plan. The more important element was the message it would send to Rebecca and Michael about who their mother really was. My second week at Sunset Manor, I established a routine that satisfied the staff while giving me freedom to work. I attended morning exercise class where I demonstrated surprising flexibility and stamina for a woman my age. I joined the book club, where I impressed the other members with thoughtful observations about the novels we discussed. I participated in craft time, creating decorative pieces I had no intention of keeping, but which earned praise from the activities' staff. Between these scheduled activities, I spent hours in the business center. The other residents rarely used the computers, intimidated by technology, or simply uninterested in staying connected to a world they felt they'd left behind. I had the space largely to myself, which allowed me to conduct phone calls and video conferences without attracting attention. My financial advisor, Gregory Martinez, had been managing my investments since James's death. Initially, he'd treated me like most of his elderly female clients, explaining concepts in simple terms and recommending conservative strategies designed to preserve capital rather than generate growth. But over the years, as I demonstrated, both knowledge and risk tolerance, our relationship had evolved into genuine collaboration. Gregory understood what I was planning and why. He'd helped me structure my finances to minimize tax liability and maximize purchasing power. He'd connected me with the real estate attorney who'd researched Harbor View Tower's ownership situation. He'd arranged the preliminary negotiations with the building's management company. Most importantly, he'd helped me understand that revenge was a luxury I couldn't afford, but justice was a business strategy that could be very profitable. The ownership corporation, Meridian Properties, was managed by a man named David Kellerman, who'd inherited the company from his father and run it into the ground through poor decisions and expensive lifestyle choices. He owed money to contractors, suppliers, and the city itself in unpaid taxes and fines. He was facing foreclosure proceedings and the possibility of bankruptcy. When Gregory approached him about a potential sale, Kellerman was initially skeptical. He'd been burned by previous negotiations with buyers who'd made lowball offers, conducted extensive inspections, and ultimately walked away from deals. But when Gregory mentioned that his client was prepared to make a cash offer with minimal contingencies, Kellerman's attitude changed dramatically. The preliminary offer was for $4.2 million, significantly below the building's assessed value but realistic, given its financial troubles and physical condition. Kellerman would retain enough money to pay off his debts and avoid bankruptcy, while I would acquire a property with substantial potential for improvement and profit. From Kellerman's perspective, he was selling to an investment group represented by Gregory Martinez. He had no idea that the actual buyer was a 73-year-old woman whose children lived in his building. The purchase process would take approximately 6 weeks to complete, involving inspections, title searches, financing arrangements, and legal documentation. During that time, I needed to maintain my role as a helpless elderly woman adjusting to life in assisted living while actually orchestrating one of the most personally satisfying real estate transactions of my life. Rebecca visited me the second weekend, bringing flowers and homemade cookies from a bakery she knew I liked. She looked around my apartment with the satisfaction of someone who'd made a difficult but necessary decision and seen it work out well. I was clearly settling in, she told Michael later in a phone call I overheard through the thin walls. The staff spoke highly of my adjustment, and I seemed more social than I'd been in years. She wasn't wrong about my social engagement. I'd become quite popular among the residents, not because I'd embraced my new lifestyle, but because I'd learned to listen to their stories with genuine interest and respect. Unlike their children, who visited briefly and spoke to them like patients, I treated them like the accomplished adults they'd been before circumstances reduced their autonomy. Martha had been a high school English teacher for 37 years, shaping thousands of young minds and earning recognition for her innovative curriculum. Harold had designed bridges and buildings that still stood throughout the region, structures that would outlast him by centuries. Eleanor had managed complex scheduling and communication systems for a major insurance company, keeping entire departments functioning smoothly. These weren't helpless people who needed to be managed. They were experienced adults who'd been convinced by their families that their wisdom and capabilities were no longer valuable. The tragedy wasn't their physical limitations or memory issues. The tragedy was that they'd internalized the message that their useful lives were over. I began organizing informal discussion groups in the evenings, encouraging residents to share stories about their careers, their achievements, their knowledge. Martha talked about literature and teaching techniques. Harold explained engineering principles and problem-solving strategies. Eleanor shared insights about office management and professional communication. Slowly, I watched them begin to remember who they'd been before they became residents of Sunset Manor. They started sitting straighter, speaking with more authority, engaging with ideas rather than just accepting entertainment. The staff noticed the change, but interpreted it as evidence of my positive influence on the community. Susan praised my leadership skills and suggested I might want to join the Resident Advisory Council. The facility director mentioned during a family conference call that I was demonstrating exceptional adjustment and helping other residents feel more engaged. Rebecca was thrilled. Michael expressed relief that I'd found my place so quickly. They spoke about me to their friends as an example of successful aging, a woman who'd embraced change and found fulfillment in her new environment. If only they knew what I was actually building. 3 weeks into my stay at Sunset Manor, Gregory called with news that the preliminary negotiations were proceeding smoothly. Kellerman was eager to close the deal quickly, and the building inspection had revealed problems that were serious but manageable with proper investment. The structural issues would require significant renovation, but they weren't catastrophic. The mechanical systems needed updating, but the building's bones were solid. More importantly, the tenant leases were all month-to-month agreements that gave the new owner substantial flexibility in setting rental terms and occupancy requirements. While I couldn't legally evict tenants without cause, I could certainly make changes that would encourage them to reconsider their housing choices. Not that I planned to evict Rebecca and Michael. That would be too simple, too quick, too clean. I had something more educational in mind. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to have their living situation controlled by someone else, to experience the anxiety of uncertain housing, to feel the powerlessness that comes with depending on another person's goodwill for basic security. I wanted them to learn what I'd felt when they'd sat in my kitchen and explained why I needed to give up my home. The irony was perfect. They'd forced me out of the house where I'd raised them, arguing that I needed supervision and community. Now they would discover that their own sophisticated urban lifestyle was subject to the whims of a landlord they'd never met. A landlord who happened to be the mother they'd dismissed as a sweet, simple burden. During my 4th week at Sunset Manor, I received a phone call that changed everything. Not the purchase of Harbor View Towers, which was proceeding exactly as planned. Something else entirely. The call came from Patricia Morrison, a woman I'd never heard of who identified herself as a social worker from the county health department. She was calling about Rebecca and Michael, she said. There had been some concerns raised about their decision to place me in residential care. Someone had filed a complaint suggesting that I'd been coerced into leaving my home against my will. The allegation was that my children had manipulated me into selling my property and entering assisted living for their financial benefit, rather than my genuine care needs. The complaint was anonymous, Patricia explained, but detailed enough to warrant investigation. She would need to interview me about my living situation, my decision-making process, and my relationship with my children. The interview could take place at Sunset Manor, but it would need to be conducted without Rebecca or Michael present. I was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. Someone had been watching my situation closely enough to understand what had really happened. Someone had cared enough to report it to authorities. Someone had recognized that a competent adult woman had been manipulated into giving up her independence. But who? Patricia scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday. She explained that if the investigation found evidence of elder abuse or financial exploitation, there could be serious consequences for Rebecca and Michael. Criminal charges, professional sanctions, public exposure. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my small apartment thinking about this unexpected development. I'd been planning to teach my children a lesson about power and respect through property ownership. But this investigation could destroy their careers, their reputations, their futures. For the first time since I'd arrived at Sunset Manor, I felt something that surprised me. Protectiveness toward Rebecca and Michael. They'd treated me poorly. They'd prioritized their inheritance over my autonomy. They'd manipulated me into abandoning the home I loved. But they were still my children, and I didn't want to see them genuinely harmed by their mistakes. I had a choice to make. I could cooperate with the investigation and potentially watch my children face serious legal consequences. Or I could Protect them from the ramifications of their actions while still teaching them the lesson they needed to learn. The decision was easier than I'd expected. I would handle this my way, on my terms, with my timeline. Not through government intervention, but through the private justice of a mother who'd finally decided to reclaim her power. But first, I needed to find out who had been watching my situation so carefully. Who had cared enough about a stranger's autonomy to risk getting involved? The answer, when it came, would surprise me more than anything my children had done. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes indoor lighting seem harsh and artificial. I dressed carefully for my interview with Patricia Morrison, choosing clothes that struck the right balance between dignity and vulnerability. A soft blue cardigan that Rebecca had selected for me, paired with the pearl earrings James had given me for our 20th anniversary. Patricia arrived precisely on time, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who'd conducted thousands of these interviews. She carried a leather portfolio and introduced herself to the Sunset Manor staff, with the authority of someone accustomed to institutional cooperation. We met in a small conference room usually reserved for family meetings and medical consultations. Patricia arranged her materials on the table between us and activated a digital recorder with my permission. Her questions began gently, focused on my general well-being and adjustment to the facility. I answered honestly about my daily routine, my interactions with other residents, my physical health and mental state. I praised the staff's professionalism and the facility's amenities. I described my apartment, my meals, my activities with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely grateful for her circumstances. But when Patricia shifted her questions to my decision to leave my home, I sensed the real purpose of her visit. She wanted to understand the timeline of events, the conversations with my children, the pressure I might have felt to make this transition. I told her the truth, but carefully. Yes, Rebecca and Michael had suggested that I might be happier in a community setting. Yes, they'd been concerned about my living alone in a large house. Yes, they'd helped me research options and make arrangements, but I emphasized that the final decision had been mine. I'd chosen Sunset Manor after visiting and speaking with residents. I'd agreed to sell the house because maintaining it had become burdensome. I'd welcomed my children's support during a difficult transition. Patricia listened carefully, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by my responses. She'd clearly spoken with someone who'd provided a different version of events. Finally, she asked the question I'd been anticipating. Mrs. Chen, did anyone pressure you to leave your home or enter this facility against your wishes? I met her eyes directly and said, No. My children were concerned about my welfare, as children should be. They offered guidance and support, as children should. The decisions about my living situation were ultimately mine to make. It wasn't technically a lie. I had made the decision, even if my motivations were more complex than Patricia could understand. She asked about my finances, whether anyone had gained control of my assets or influenced my estate planning. Again, I answered truthfully, but incompletely. My children were aware of my general financial situation, but they didn't control my accounts or have access to my investments. My lawyer handled my legal affairs according to my instructions. What I didn't mention was that my lawyer was currently finalizing the purchase of their apartment building. After an hour of questions, Patricia seemed satisfied that I wasn't being abused or exploited in any obvious way. She provided me with contact information for elder advocacy services and encouraged me to reach out if my circumstances changed. She also mentioned that the investigation would remain open pending additional information. As she packed her materials, I asked the question that had been bothering me since her initial phone call. Can you tell me who filed the complaint? Patricia shook her head. Anonymous reports are kept confidential to protect the reporting party, but I can tell you that whoever contacted us seemed very familiar with your situation and genuinely concerned about your welfare. After she left, I sat in the conference room thinking about her words. Someone familiar with my situation. Someone who'd been watching closely enough to understand what Rebecca and Michael had done. Someone who'd cared enough to take action. The answer came to me that evening during dinner at table 4. Martha was describing a conversation she'd had with her daughter about holiday plans when Harold interrupted with one of his engineering tangents about heating systems and energy efficiency. "Harold," Eleanor said with gentle exasperation. "We were talking about Thanksgiving, not thermodynamics." "Sorry," Harold said, looking embarrassed. "I just get excited about problem solving. It's a habit from 40 years of analyzing systems and identifying flaws." That's when I realized who had reported my situation to the county. Harold, the retired engineer who noticed everything and instinctively looked for problems that needed solving. Who'd been listening to my story during our meals together and recognized the signs of manipulation and coercion. Who'd understood that a competent woman had been systematically undermined by her own children. Harold, who rarely spoke, but observed, constantly. Who'd spent his career identifying structural weaknesses and recommending interventions. Who'd applied those same analytical skills to my family dynamics and determined that outside intervention was warranted. I caught his eye across the table and smiled. He blushed slightly but smiled back, and I saw recognition pass between us. He knew that I knew, and he wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. After dinner, I approached him as he was leaving the dining room. "Harold, would you like to take a walk in the garden? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." We walked slowly, along the concrete paths between carefully maintained flower beds. The evening air was cool and pleasant, and other residents were enjoying the outdoors before the sun set completely. "You reported my situation to the county," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Harold nodded. "I hope you're not angry. I've seen too many structural failures that could have been prevented with early intervention. Your situation had all the warning signs of a system under pressure." I stopped walking and turned to face him. "I'm not angry. I'm grateful. It takes courage to get involved in someone else's family business." "Are you being pressured by your children?" he asked directly. "Because if you are, there are legal protections available. You don't have to accept their decisions if they're not in your best interest." I smiled at this kind, observant man who'd recognized my situation and taken action to protect me. "Harold, what would you say if I told you that my children think they've manipulated me into giving up my independence, but actually I'm orchestrating a lesson that will teach them more about power and consequences than they ever expected to learn?" He studied my face for a long moment, his engineer's mind, processing this new information. "I'd say that sounds like a counter-strategy designed to address the structural imbalance in your family dynamic." "Exactly. And I'd ask if you need any assistance with the implementation phase." I laughed, genuinely delighted by his response. "As a matter of fact, I might. How do you feel about helping an elderly woman reclaim her authority through strategic real estate acquisition?" Harold's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm I'd seen when he discussed mechanical systems. "Mrs. Chen, I'd be honored to assist with any project that involves problem-solving and justice." And that's how I gained an ally in my campaign to teach Rebecca and Michael what it meant to underestimate their mother. Harold, it turned out, had more resources and knowledge than anyone at Sunset Manor realized. During his engineering career, he'd worked on commercial construction projects, industrial renovations, and urban development initiatives. He understood building systems, construction management, and property development from both technical and financial perspectives. More importantly, he'd been forced into Sunset Manor by circumstances similar to mine. His daughter had convinced him to sell his house and move to assisted living after a minor fall that required stitches but no ongoing medical care. She'd been more subtle than Rebecca and Michael, framing her arguments around safety and social engagement rather than financial necessity. But the result had been the same: A competent adult had been manipulated into surrendering his independence. Harold had been planning his own form of intervention, though his approach was more systematic than mine. He'd been documenting patterns of elder manipulation throughout the facility, collecting stories from residents who'd been coerced into giving up their homes and autonomy. He'd been researching legal precedents and advocacy resources, building a case for broader intervention. When he'd heard my story during our dinner conversations, he'd recognized a situation that warranted immediate attention. My children's behavior had been more aggressive and financially motivated than most, making it a clear case for investigation. But now that he understood my own counter-strategy, he was intrigued by the possibility of achieving justice through private action rather than legal intervention. He offered to help with the technical aspects of my building acquisition, using his construction knowledge to assess renovation needs and project costs. Over the following weeks, Harold became my unofficial partner in planning the Harborview Towers purchase. We met in the business center during the afternoons, where he helped me review building inspection reports and renovation proposals. His engineering background allowed him to identify potential problems that my other advisors had missed and suggest solutions that would be both effective and cost-efficient. He also helped me understand the psychological impact my plan would have on Rebecca and Michael. As someone who'd experienced manipulation by adult children, he could predict their likely reactions and help me prepare for various scenarios. They'll be shocked initially, he predicted, then angry when they realize they've been outmaneuvered, then worried about their living situation and what you might do with your new authority. And then, I asked, then they'll have to decide whether to approach you with respect and humility or try to find new ways to manipulate the situation to their advantage. What do you think they'll choose? Harold considered this carefully. Based on what you've told me about their behavior, they'll probably try manipulation first. They're accustomed to treating you as someone who can be managed rather than someone who deserves respect. It will take time for them to understand that the power dynamic has shifted permanently. And if they don't learn, then you'll have the authority to teach them more direct lessons about consequences and accountability. The purchase of Harborview Towers was scheduled to close on a Friday afternoon in late November, exactly 8 weeks after I'd moved into Sunset Manor. Gregory had arranged for the final paperwork to be signed at the building itself, in the management office that would soon become my domain. I told the Sunset Manor staff that I had a medical appointment that day and would be out for several hours. Rebecca had offered to drive me to doctor visits, but I'd declined, explaining that the facility's transportation service was more convenient, and I didn't want to burden her. The transportation was real, though not through Sunset Manor. Gregory picked me up in his luxury sedan, and we drove to Harborview Towers in comfortable silence. I'd worn my best outfit for the occasion, a charcoal gray suit I'd purchased years earlier for special events, paired with the pearl necklace James had given me for our silver anniversary. I wanted to look like the successful businesswoman I was about to become, not the helpless elderly woman my children thought they'd left behind. The closing took place in the building's management office on the ground floor, a space that would soon be redecorated according to my preferences. David Kellerman was there with his attorney, looking relieved and slightly desperate. The various professionals involved in the transaction moved through their procedures with practiced efficiency. I signed document after document, transferring funds and assuming ownership of a property worth significantly more than I was paying for it. When the final signature was complete, Kellerman handed me the keys with the expression of a man who'd just avoided bankruptcy. "Congratulations, Mrs. Chen," he said. "I hope you'll be happy with your investment." I smiled and accepted the keys, feeling their weight in my hand. "I'm confident it will serve my purposes very well." After Kellerman and his attorney left, Gregory and I toured the building with the maintenance supervisor, a competent man named Frank, who'd been struggling to keep systems functional despite budget constraints. I asked detailed questions about mechanical systems, structural issues, and renovation priorities. Frank seemed surprised by my technical knowledge, but pleased to work with an owner who understood the complexities of building management. We rode the elevator to the 14th floor, where Rebecca lived in Unit 1407. I stood in the hallway, outside her door, holding the keys to her building, knowing that her entire sophisticated lifestyle was now subject to my approval. Then we visited the 10th floor, where Michael and Linda lived in Unit 1022. Their door was decorated with a seasonal wreath that Linda had probably chosen to complement their interior design scheme. They'd worked so hard to create the perfect urban lifestyle, the perfect image of young professional success. Now their perfect life belonged to me. Gregory dropped me off at Sunset Manor in time for dinner, and I joined my table mates with the satisfaction of someone who'd just completed the most important business transaction of her life. I listened to their conversations about the day's activities and upcoming holiday plans, while privately savoring the knowledge that tomorrow, everything would change. Rebecca and Michael would receive official notification from the new building management company on Monday morning. They would learn that Harborview Towers had been sold to a private investor who would be implementing new policies and procedures. They would be invited to attend a mandatory residents meeting the following weekend to discuss the transition. They would have no idea that the investor was their mother until I walked into that meeting and introduced myself as their new landlord. The woman they'd dismissed as a burden had just become the person who controlled their housing. The woman they'd manipulated into giving up her home had just purchased theirs. The lesson was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with the crisp precision of autumn settling into winter. I woke before dawn as I had every day for the past 8 weeks. But this time, the anticipation thrumming through my veins had nothing to do with facility breakfast schedules or planned activities. Today was the day Rebecca and Michael would receive their first hint that their carefully arranged world was about to shift beneath their feet. I dressed with particular care, selecting a burgundy sweater that brought out the silver in my hair and made me feel both elegant and authoritative. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with eyes that held secrets, and I found myself smiling at the transformation. 8 weeks ago, I had been a displaced person, shuffled from my own home into institutional care by children who thought they understood what was best for me. Now I was a property owner, a businesswoman, a force they had never bothered to recognize. The dining room buzzed with its usual morning energy. Martha was explaining to Eleanor why the coffee tasted different today, while Patricia complained about the temperature of her scrambled eggs. Harold caught my eye as I approached our table, and I saw the subtle nod that acknowledged our shared understanding of what this day would bring. "Good morning, Dorothy," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of conspiracy. "Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you. I have a feeling today is going to be quite interesting." The morning activities proceeded with their normal rhythm. I attended exercise class, where I demonstrated the flexibility and strength that had surprised everyone when I first arrived. The instructor, a cheerful young woman named Kelly, had initially treated me with the careful consideration reserved for fragile elderly people. But over the weeks, she had learned to push me harder, recognizing that my limitations were far fewer than my age might suggest. During the stretching portion, I found myself thinking about flexibility in broader terms. How adaptable were Rebecca and Michael when their assumptions were challenged? How quickly could they adjust to new realities when their comfortable certainties were removed? Today would begin to answer those questions. After exercise, I spent time in the business center, ostensibly checking email but actually monitoring communications from Gregory and the management company. The official notifications had been sent at 8 o'clock that morning, delivered by certified mail to every unit in Harborview Towers. By now, Rebecca and Michael should have received the letters informing them of the ownership change and the mandatory residents meeting scheduled for Saturday afternoon. The letters were professionally worded, explaining that Meridian Properties had sold the building to Chen Investment Holdings, effective immediately. All existing leases would be honored, but residents should expect updates to building policies and procedures. The new management company would be available to address questions and concerns during the transition period. What the letters didn't mention was that Chen Investment Holdings was a corporation I had established specifically for this purchase, with myself as the sole shareholder and decision-maker. That revelation would come during Saturday's meeting, when I would introduce myself as their new landlord in person. I had debated whether to use my married name for the business entity, knowing that Chen might trigger recognition. But Rebecca and Michael had always been self-absorbed enough to assume that common surnames were merely coincidental. They would never imagine that their elderly mother, recently placed in assisted living, could be sophisticated enough to acquire their apartment building. By mid-morning, my phone began ringing. Rebecca's number appeared on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, Michael called. I let that go to voicemail as well. I wanted to hear what they had to say, how they would frame this development before I responded. Rebecca's message was tense with barely controlled anxiety. Mom, I got this weird letter about our building being sold. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, but I wanted to check if you'd heard anything about it. Maybe through one of your new friends at the facility. Anyway, call me back when you get a chance. Michael's message was more direct. Hi, Mom. Linda and I got this notice about new building ownership. It's probably routine, but we're a little concerned about potential rent increases or policy changes. I know you don't really deal with this stuff anymore, but I thought maybe Harold or one of the other residents might have experience with property management. Give me a call. I listened to both messages twice, analyzing their tone and word choices. Rebecca was trying to sound casual while clearly feeling unsettled. Michael was attempting to maintain control by suggesting I might need to ask other residents for information, still positioning himself as the competent child managing his mother's limitations. Neither of them had considered the possibility that I might have information they lacked, or that I might be connected to their situation in any way beyond geographic proximity. I called Rebecca back during lunch, timing the conversation to occur while I was surrounded by other residents in the dining room. The background noise would reinforce her assumptions about my diminished circumstances while providing me with witnesses to my apparent innocence. Hi, sweetheart, I said when she answered on the first ring. I got your message about some building issue. Oh, Mom. Thanks for calling back. It's probably nothing serious, but we got this notice that our building has been sold to some investment company. I'm sure everything will be fine, but you know how these corporate buyers can be about raising rents and changing rules. That does sound concerning, dear. What's the name of the company? Chen Investment Holdings. Never heard of them, which makes me nervous. I tried to look them up online, but there's not much information available. That usually means either they're very new or very private. I made appropriate sympathetic noises while internally appreciating the irony of my daughter researching my own company and finding it mysterious. Well, I'm sure they'll explain everything during the transition. These things usually work out fine. There's going to be a mandatory meeting this Saturday for all residents. I hate giving up my weekend, but I suppose we need to attend. Michael and Linda are going too. That sounds like a good idea. You'll want to understand any changes that might affect your living situation. Exactly. I just hope we're not dealing with some slumlord who's going to let the building deteriorate or jack up our rent. We both love living there, and the market is so crazy right now that finding comparable apartments would be nearly impossible. I listened to Rebecca express her anxieties about housing security and financial stability, the same concerns I had felt when she and Michael had pressured me to sell my home. The difference was that her fears were about potential inconvenience and increased costs, while mine had been about losing the place where I had built my entire adult life. I'm sure everything will work out for the best, I told her, using the same tone of bland reassurance that she had used with me during our kitchen meeting. You're both smart and capable. You'll adapt to whatever changes come your way. After ending the call, I sat in the dining room savoring the reversal of our conversation dynamics. For the first time in years, Rebecca had called me seeking comfort, and reassurance about circumstances beyond her control. For the first time in years, I had been the one offering platitudes while holding information that could ease her anxiety if I chose to share it. But I wasn't ready to ease her anxiety yet. She needed to experience uncertainty, to feel the vulnerability of depending on someone else's decisions about her living situation. She needed to understand what it meant to have your life disrupted by forces you couldn't influence or control. Michael called later that afternoon, during the time when I usually visited the facility's library. I answered while sitting in a comfortable chair near the biography section, surrounded by books about people who had overcome challenges and achieved remarkable things, despite others' limitations of them. "Hi, Mom. How are you settling in? I know we haven't talked much since you moved, but Linda and I have been thinking about you." "I'm doing very well, thank you. The staff here is wonderful, and I've made some good friends among the other residents." "That's great to hear." "I actually called because Linda and I are dealing with this building situation, and I thought maybe you or Harold might have some insight into property management issues." Again, the assumption that I might need to consult with other residents for information rather than possessing knowledge myself. Again, the patronizing suggestion that my value lay in my connections to other elderly people rather than my own capabilities. "What kind of situation are you dealing with?" "Our building got sold to an investment company, and we're not sure what to expect. The new owners are requiring all residents to attend a meeting this weekend, which seems a little heavy-handed. I'm wondering if this is normal procedure, or if we should be concerned about major changes coming." "Have you tried researching the new company?" "Rebecca looked them up, but there's not much public information. That makes me suspicious about their intentions and their level of professionalism." I smiled at the irony of my son questioning my professionalism while having no idea he was talking to the subject of his research. "Well, Michael, sometimes companies maintain privacy for legitimate business reasons. The meeting will probably answer your questions." "I suppose so. I just hate feeling like we're at the mercy of some faceless corporation that could change our living situation without warning." "Change can be difficult," I agreed, "especially when you feel like you don't have control over important decisions that affect your daily life." "Exactly. We've worked hard to build the lifestyle we want, and it's frustrating to think that some stranger could disrupt everything we've established." Michael continued expressing his frustrations about housing insecurity and loss of control, describing exactly the emotions I had experienced when he and Rebecca had disrupted my established lifestyle. But he spoke without any recognition of the parallel, without any awareness that his current anxiety mirrored what he had put me through just 2 months earlier. The conversation ended with Michael asking me to keep my ears open for any information about property investment or building management that might come up in my conversations with other residents. He still saw me as someone who might be useful for gathering secondhand information rather than someone who might possess firsthand knowledge. That evening, Harold and I took our usual walk in the facility gardens, discussing the day's developments. The November air was sharp and clean, and most of the other residents had moved indoors after dinner. We had the pathways largely to ourselves, which allowed us to speak freely about the unfolding situation. "How did they sound when they called?" Harold asked as we paused near the fountain that centered the garden space. "Anxious, uncertain, a little entitled if I'm being honest. They're upset about having their comfortable circumstances threatened by decisions made without their input. So they're experiencing exactly what you went through when they pressured you to move here." "Yes, but without any recognition of the parallel. They see their situation as an unfair imposition, while they viewed my situation as a necessary intervention." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "That's not surprising. People rarely recognize their own behavior when they're on the receiving end of similar treatment. It takes significant emotional maturity to make those connections." "Do you think they'll make the connection when they realize who bought their building?" "Eventually, yes. but their initial reactions will probably be shock, anger, and attempts to manipulate the situation to their advantage. They'll need time to process the reversal of power dynamics. We continued, walking in comfortable silence, both of us contemplating the weekend's upcoming revelation. Harold had become more than an ally in my campaign to reclaim authority. He had become a friend whose analytical mind helped me think through the psychological and emotional dimensions of my plan. During my marriage to James, I had rarely had opportunities for this kind of intellectual partnership. James had been a good man, loving and supportive, but not particularly interested in strategic thinking or complex problem-solving. Our conversations had focused on daily practicalities and family concerns rather than abstract concepts or long-term planning. Harold's engineering background had trained him to examine systems, identify weaknesses, and design solutions. Applied to human relationships, these skills provided insights that I found both useful and validating. He helped me understand that my children's behavior followed predictable patterns and that my responses could be calculated to achieve specific outcomes. "Have you decided what you want to accomplish during Saturday's meeting?" he asked as we circled back toward the facility entrance. "I want them to understand that I'm not the helpless elderly woman they thought they were managing. I want them to recognize that their assumptions about my capabilities were wrong. And I want them to experience what it feels like to have someone else control their living situation. Those are all achievable goals, but you should also think about what comes after the meeting. Once they know you own their building, how do you want your relationship with them to evolve?" It was a good question, one I had been avoiding because the answer was complicated. Part of me wanted to maintain power over them indefinitely, to keep them in a state of uncertainty as punishment for their manipulation. But part of me still loved them and wanted to rebuild our relationship on more equal terms. "I want them to respect me," I said finally. "Not as a burden to be managed, but as their mother who deserves consideration and autonomy. I want them to understand that their success doesn't make them more important than the people who sacrifice to help them achieve it. And if they're not capable of that kind of growth, then they'll discover that their new landlord can be as controlling as they were." Harold smiled at this, appreciating the elegant justice of my position. "I think Saturday is going to be very educational for everyone involved." The week passed slowly, each day bringing me closer to the confrontation that would redefine my relationship with Rebecca and Michael forever. I maintained my normal routine at Sunset Manor, attending activities and meals with the same pleasant demeanor that had characterized my stay from the beginning. But internally, I was preparing for a performance that would require all my emotional strength and strategic thinking. I had been underestimated my entire adult life. As a young wife and mother, I had been seen as supportive, but not particularly capable beyond domestic responsibilities. As a middle-aged woman, I had been valued for my reliability, but not consulted about important decisions. As an elderly widow, I had been dismissed as someone whose useful life was essentially over. Saturday would mark the end of other people's assumptions about my limitations. Saturday would announce the beginning of Dorothy Chen's emergence as a force to be reckoned with. Friday evening, I received final confirmation from Gregory that all legal and financial aspects of the building acquisition were complete. Chen Investment Holdings now held clear title to Harbor View Towers, and I had full authority to make decisions about its management and future. The renovation plans were approved, the construction contracts were signed, and the building would soon undergo improvements that would increase both its value and its appeal to residents. Rebecca and Michael would benefit from these improvements. While living under the authority of the mother, they had dismissed as incompetent. I spent Friday night laying out the outfit I would wear to the residents' meeting. A navy blue dress suit that conveyed professional authority, paired with the diamond earrings James had given me for our 40th anniversary. I wanted to look like someone who commanded respect, someone whose decisions carried weight and consequences. Saturday morning, I told the Sunset Manor staff that I would be visiting friends for the afternoon and might not return until evening. The transportation I had arranged was not the facility van, but Gregory's sedan, which would deliver me to Harborview Towers in appropriate style. As I prepared to leave my small apartment for what might be the most important afternoon of my life, I caught sight of myself in the mirror one final time. The woman looking back at me was no longer the displaced person who had arrived at Sunset Manor 8 weeks earlier. She was someone who had reclaimed her power through intelligence, planning, and sheer determination. She was someone my children had never bothered to meet, but were about to discover they should have known all along. The drive to Harborview Towers took 20 minutes through downtown traffic. Gregory and I discussed final details of the presentation I would give to the residents, reviewing the balance between revelation and restraint that would achieve maximum impact without crossing into cruelty. "Remember," Gregory said as we pulled into the building's circular driveway, "you want them to understand that you're in control now, but you also want to leave room for the relationship to evolve positively, if they're willing to change their behavior. And if they're not willing, then you have all the authority you need to teach them more direct lessons about respect and consequences." I gathered my materials and walked through the lobby of Harborview Towers as its new owner for the first time. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had impressed Rebecca and Michael during their apartment searches now belonged to me. The concierge desk, the mailbox area, the elevator banks that carried residents to their sophisticated urban apartments all operated under my oversight. The residents' meeting was scheduled to take place in the building's community room on the second floor, a space designed for social gatherings and building events. When I arrived, approximately 60 people were already seated in chairs arranged theater-style facing a podium at the front of the room. I spotted Rebecca immediately, sitting in the third row with her usual posture of professional alertness. She wore a black pantsuit that projected competence and authority, and she was taking notes on a legal pad as if this were a business meeting requiring her legal expertise. Michael and Linda sat 2 rows behind her, both looking slightly uncomfortable, but determined to handle whatever challenges this ownership change might present. Michael had chosen the conservative business attire that made him look older and more serious, while Linda wore the kind of carefully coordinated outfit that suggested she viewed this as a social obligation, requiring appropriate presentation. Neither Rebecca nor Michael noticed me as I entered the room. Why would they? Their mother was safely tucked away in assisted living, being cared for by professional staff, while they handled the important business of their adult lives. I took a seat in the back row, arranging my materials and observing the crowd while we waited for the meeting to begin. The residents represented the demographic Rebecca and Michael aspired to join: young professionals, successful couples, people who had achieved the financial security that allowed them to afford luxury urban living. They were also people who had never experienced housing insecurity, who had never been forced to give up homes they loved, who had never had their living situations controlled by others' decisions about what was best for them. That was about to change. At exactly 2 o'clock, Gregory entered the room and approached the podium. He introduced himself as the representative of Chen Investment Holdings and thanked the residents for attending the mandatory meeting. He explained that the purpose was to introduce the new building ownership and discuss upcoming changes to policies and procedures. "Before we begin with the business agenda," Gregory said, "I'd like to introduce you to the principal owner of Chen Investment Holdings, who will be taking personal responsibility for this property and your community." He gestured toward the back of the room, and I stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Dorothy Chen." The silence that followed was profound. I walked slowly down the center aisle, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. Some residents looked curious, others confused. But in the third and fifth rows, 2 people looked like they had just seen a ghost. Rebecca's legal pad slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. Michael's mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again without producing sound. Linda grabbed Michael's arm as if she needed physical support to process what she was seeing. I reached the podium and looked out over the crowd, making eye contact with as many residents as possible before focusing on my children. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice clear and strong. "My name is Dorothy Chen, and as of this week, I am the owner of Harborview Towers. I'm looking forward to working with all of you to maintain and improve this wonderful community." I paused, letting the reality settle over the room. I'm sure some of you have questions about my background and qualifications for this role. I'm also sure that some of you, I looked directly at Rebecca and Michael, are surprised to discover who your new landlord is. Rebecca had gone completely pale. Michael was staring at me as if I had materialized from another dimension. I want to assure everyone that my primary goal is to enhance the quality of life in this building while maintaining the standards that attracted you to live here in the first place. However, I also want to be clear that I expect residents to treat building management with respect and consideration. I smiled, allowing just a hint of steel to show through the pleasantness. I believe in treating people the way they treat others. Those who show respect and consideration will find me to be a responsive and accommodating landlord. Those who attempt to manipulate or take advantage of the situation will discover that I can be far less flexible. The room was absolutely silent. Even the residents who didn't understand the personal dynamics could sense the tension radiating from the middle rows where my children sat frozen in their chairs. "Now," I continued, "let's discuss the exciting improvements that will be coming to Harborview Towers over the next several months." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before the first resident raised her hand. A woman in her 30s sitting near the front asked about parking policies and whether the building's gym hours would change. Her question broke the spell, and gradually other hands went up. Other voices joined the conversation about practical matters and building improvements. I answered each question with the confidence of someone who had done her homework thoroughly. Yes, the fitness center would be expanded and updated with new equipment. No, there would be no immediate changes to parking assignments, though we were exploring options for additional guest spaces. The building's security system would be upgraded, the lobby would receive cosmetic improvements, and the rooftop terrace would be enhanced with better seating and weather protection. Throughout this practical discussion, I was acutely aware of Rebecca and Michael sitting in stunned silence. They hadn't asked a single question, hadn't moved from their seats, hadn't even looked at each other. They were processing a reality so far outside their expectations that their usual quick thinking and professional competence had simply shut down. Linda whispered something to Michael, who shook his head slightly without taking his eyes off me. Rebecca was staring at her hands, as if looking at me directly might make the situation even more incomprehensibly real than it already was. When the formal presentation concluded, residents began approaching the podium with individual questions and concerns. I handled each conversation with patience and professionalism, establishing myself as accessible but authoritative. Several people complimented me on my plans for the building and expressed relief that the new ownership seemed committed to maintaining quality standards. Rebecca and Michael remained seated until the room was nearly empty. Finally, they approached, together, moving like people walking through deep water, unsure of their footing. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this? What's happening here?" "This is a residents' meeting, sweetheart. I'm explaining to everyone how I plan to manage their building." "Their building? Mom, this is our building. We live here. How can you own our building?" Michael found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "This doesn't make sense. How could you buy this place? You just moved into assisted living. You sold your house. Where did you get the money for something like this?" I smiled at them with the same patient expression I'd used when they were children asking questions I knew they weren't ready to understand completely. "I didn't sell my house, Michael. You assumed I would sell it because that fit your plans, but I never agreed to that." "But the real estate agent," Rebecca started, has been on retainer for months, helping me understand property values and market conditions. I needed to know what my house was worth before I could determine how much I could afford to spend on other investments. The color was returning to Rebecca's face, but it was the flush of anger rather than the pallor of shock. You lied to us. You let us believe you were selling the house to pay for the care facility. I never said I was selling the house. You said I should sell the house, and I said I'd think about it. I did think about it. I decided to keep it and find more interesting ways to use my resources. Michael stepped closer, his professional instincts finally engaging. Mom, this is insane. You can't just buy buildings on a whim. Do you have any idea what's involved in property management? Do you understand the legal liabilities, the financial responsibilities, the complexity of dealing with tenants? I understand quite a bit, actually. I've been studying real estate investment and property management for several years now. I've consulted with lawyers, accountants, construction managers, and business advisors. I've done extensive research on this building specifically, including its financial history, structural condition, and market position. I paused, watching their faces as they absorbed this information. What I don't understand is why you both seem so surprised that I might be capable of learning new things and making independent decisions. Did you think my brain stopped working when your father died? Linda had been standing slightly behind Michael. But now she stepped forward with the kind of forced smile that suggested she was trying to diffuse tension through social pleasantries. Mrs. Chen, this is all very impressive, but I think what Michael and Rebecca are concerned about is whether you've really thought through all the implications of such a major purchase. Linda, I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite confident in my decision-making abilities. After all, I successfully raised 2 children who became accomplished professionals, managed a household for 47 years, and maintained financial stability through various economic challenges. Buying one apartment building seems rather manageable by comparison. Rebecca's legal training was finally kicking in, and I could see her shifting into advocacy mode. Mom, we need to talk about this privately. There are family considerations here that shouldn't be discussed in front of other residents. Actually, Rebecca, I think this is exactly the right venue for our conversation. After all, you're residents of this building now, and building policy affects all residents equally. I wouldn't want to give the impression that I play favorites. The barb hit home. Rebecca's professional facade cracked slightly, revealing the frustrated daughter underneath. This is ridiculous. You're our mother. We're your children. You can't treat us like random tenants. You're absolutely right. You're not random tenants. You're tenants who happen to be related to the landlord. That means I have even higher expectations for your behavior and your respect for building policies. Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was overwhelmed by problems he couldn't solve with logic alone. Mom, I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish here. If you wanted to invest in real estate, why didn't you talk to us? We could have helped you find something appropriate, something that made sense for someone in your situation. My situation? You know what I mean. Someone your age, with your level of experience. This building is worth millions of dollars. The insurance alone must be astronomical. The maintenance costs, the legal compliance requirements, the tenant management. It's a full-time job for someone with professional experience. I looked at my son with something approaching pity. Even now, even faced with evidence of my capabilities, he was still trying to position himself as the competent adult who needed to manage his incompetent mother. Michael, what exactly do you think I've been doing with my time since your father died? Did you imagine I was just sitting in my house waiting for you to visit? He didn't answer, but his expression suggested that was exactly what he'd imagined. I've been learning, reading, taking courses, consulting with professionals, building knowledge and skills that you never bothered to ask about because you were too busy assuming I was declining into helplessness. Rebecca's frustration was building toward explosion. I could see the signs in her posture, her breathing, the way she was clenching and unclenching her hands. She'd always had a temper when things didn't go according to her plans. "This is manipulative, Mom. You're punishing us for caring about your welfare. We were worried about you living alone in that big house. We wanted you to be safe and have social interaction with people your own age. We were trying to help. By pressuring me to give up my home and move into institutional care so you could inherit your money while you were young enough to enjoy it?" The accusation hung in the air between us. Rebecca's face went through several expressions before settling on indignant denial. "That's not... We weren't. Mom, the inheritance was never the primary consideration. We were genuinely concerned about your quality of life. And now I'm genuinely concerned about yours." Michael stepped between Rebecca and me, recognizing that the conversation was escalating beyond productive discussion. "Mom, can we please continue this at home? At your place, I mean. At Sunset Manor. This isn't the right setting for a family." Conversation. "Actually, Michael, this is the perfect setting. Because this is where you live now, and I own where you live now, and we need to establish how that's going to work going forward." I gathered my materials from the podium, signaling that the formal portion of our interaction was concluding. "You both have my contact information if you need to reach building management about any concerns or requests. Gregory here will be handling day-to-day operations, but I'll be personally involved in all major decisions affecting residents." "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the tone she'd used as a child when she was trying to negotiate her way out of consequences. "We should talk about this as a family, away from here, away from business considerations." "Should we? You didn't think we needed to talk as a family when you decided I should leave my home. You presented me with a plan you'd already developed and asked me to comply with it. I'm simply returning the courtesy." Linda tried once more to bridge the growing chasm between us. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sure we can work something out that makes everyone comfortable. Family relationships are more important than business arrangements." "I agree completely, Linda. Family relationships are incredibly important. That's why I'm so disappointed that it took me buying this building for Rebecca and Michael to recognize that I might be capable of making my own decisions about my life." I looked at each of them in turn, making sure they understood that this conversation was ending on my terms. "I'll be returning to Sunset Manor now. If you have questions about building policies or renovation schedules, please contact Gregory during normal business hours. If you want to have a conversation with your mother about family relationships, you're welcome to visit me. But understand that those are two separate discussions that will happen in two separate contexts." Rebecca made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Mom, you can't just walk away from us. We need to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it." "I'm doing exactly what you did to me, sweetheart. I'm making decisions about your living situation based on what I think is best for everyone involved. The difference is that I actually have the authority to enforce my decisions." With that, I walked out of the community room, leaving my children to process the complete reversal of power dynamics that had just occurred. Gregory followed me, and we rode the elevator down to the lobby in satisfied silence. The ride back to Sunset Manor gave me time to decompress from the intensity of the confrontation. I felt energized rather than drained, as if I'd been holding my breath for months and finally been allowed to exhale. The woman who had been dismissed as a burden requiring management had just demonstrated that she was capable of managing others. But I also felt something unexpected, a hollow sadness about the necessity of teaching my children such a harsh lesson. I had hoped that our kitchen conversation months ago might lead to genuine dialogue about my autonomy and their assumptions. Instead, it had led to manipulation and pressure tactics that forced me to respond with strategies they never could have anticipated. Gregory broke the silence as we turned into the Sunset Manor driveway. "How do you feel about how that went?" "Satisfied, mostly. They needed to understand that their assumptions about my capabilities were wrong, and I think that message was delivered effectively. And how do you think they'll respond? Rebecca will be angry first, then calculating. She'll try to find ways to challenge my ownership or manipulate the situation to her advantage. Michael will be confused and hurt, then analytical. He'll try to understand what went wrong with his assessment of my competence. Do you think they'll visit you here to continue the conversation? I considered this as we pulled up to the facility entrance. Eventually, yes. But first, they'll spend time talking to each other, trying to figure out how to handle this development. They'll approach me when they think they've developed a strategy for managing the situation. And when they do, they'll discover that I'm not as easily managed as they thought. I thanked Gregory for his assistance and walked into Sunset Manor with the confidence of someone who had just successfully executed a complex plan. The lobby felt different now, not because anything had changed about the facility, but because I was no longer a displaced person seeking comfort. I was a businesswoman who had chosen this location as a temporary base of operations while I pursued other interests. Harold was waiting in the sitting area near the main desk, pretending to read a magazine while actually watching for my return. When he saw me, he stood and approached with the kind of carefully casual manner that suggested he was eager for information, but didn't want to appear obvious about it. "Dorothy, how was your afternoon out? You look rather pleased with yourself." "It was very productive, thank you. I accomplished everything I'd hoped to accomplish." "And how did your children react to your news?" "About as well as you'd expect. Shock, disbelief, anger, attempts to regain control of the narrative. They're going to need some time to process the new reality." We walked toward the dining room together, where the dinner service was beginning. The familiar routine of institutional meals felt comforting after the emotional intensity of the afternoon, a return to the peaceful simplicity that had characterized my life at Sunset Manor. But that simplicity was about to become more complicated. Rebecca and Michael now knew where I was living and had compelling reasons to visit. The confrontation at Harbor View Towers had been the opening move in a longer game, and I needed to prepare for their inevitable attempts to reassert their authority over my decisions. Dinner conversation at our table was livelier than usual. Martha was excited about a visit from her granddaughter planned for the following weekend. Eleanor had received a letter from an old colleague that included gossip about their former workplace. Patricia had found something new to complain about regarding the facility's laundry service. I participated in the conversation while mentally reviewing the afternoon's events and planning my responses to whatever Rebecca and Michael might try next. They were intelligent, determined people who weren't accustomed to being outmaneuvered. They would certainly attempt to regain the upper hand in our relationship, probably through some combination of emotional manipulation and practical arguments about my supposed limitations. But they were operating from a fundamental disadvantage. Now, I had demonstrated capabilities they didn't know I possessed, and I controlled something they needed. For the first time in years, the balance of power in our family favored me rather than them. After dinner, I spent time in the facility's library, a quiet space where I could think without interruption. I pulled a biography from the shelf, something about a woman who had overcome significant obstacles to achieve success in a male-dominated field. But I found myself reading the same paragraph repeatedly without absorbing its content. My mind kept returning to the expressions on Rebecca and Michael's faces when they realized who owned their building. The shock had been complete and genuine, confirming that they had truly seen me as incapable of sophisticated planning or independent action. Even faced with evidence of my competence, their first instinct had been to question my decision-making rather than acknowledge their misjudgment. That response told me everything I needed to know about the depth of their condescension and the amount of work required to change their fundamental assumptions about me. Sunday morning brought the inevitable phone calls. Rebecca tried first at 8:30, calling while I was having coffee in the facility's small cafe area. I let it go to voicemail, wanting to hear her approach before deciding how to respond. Her message was carefully controlled, the voice of a lawyer trying to manage a difficult client. "Mom, I think we need to talk about yesterday's meeting." There are some important issues we should discuss, and I'd like to come visit you today if that works with your schedule. Please call me back when you get this. Michael called 20 minutes later, his message more direct but equally strategic. Hi, Mom. Linda and I were hoping we could visit you this afternoon. We have some questions about your recent business activities, and we think it would be better to discuss them in person. Let me know what time would be convenient for you. Both messages struck the same tone, controlled courtesy masking urgent concern. They wanted to visit me on my territory at Sunset Manor, where they could use the institutional setting to reinforce their narrative about my diminished capacity and need for their guidance. I decided to return Rebecca's call first, curious about how she would frame her request for a meeting. Mom, thank you for calling back. I was hoping we could get together today to talk through what happened yesterday. I'm still trying to understand your decision-making process. My decision-making process regarding what, specifically? The building purchase, obviously. Mom, this is a huge financial commitment with serious ongoing responsibilities. I'm concerned that you might not have fully considered all the implications. There it was, the assumption that I couldn't have made a rational decision because I lacked the capacity to understand complex financial matters. Rebecca, I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite satisfied with my analysis of the investment opportunity. I consulted with qualified professionals and conducted thorough due diligence before making my purchase decision. But Mom, you're 73 years old. You're living in assisted care. Even if you did your research, the practical aspects of property management are incredibly demanding. Who's going to handle emergencies? Who's going to deal with difficult tenants? Who's going to oversee maintenance and repairs? I've retained a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations. I'll be involved in major decisions and policy development, but I won't be personally unclogging toilets or replacing light bulbs. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, regrouping. Okay, but what about the financial risk? Real estate markets can be volatile. Property values can decline. Rental income can fluctuate. You could lose everything if the investment goes bad. Yes, I could. Just like you could lose your job if the legal market changes, or Michael could lose his position if the tech industry shifts. All investments involve risk, Rebecca. The question is whether the potential returns justify the risk level. But this is different. This is your security we're talking about. The money from your house sale was supposed to ensure you had enough resources for long-term care. Except I didn't sell my house, so that money is still available if I need it. The building purchase was made with separate funds that I've been accumulating for several years. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear Rebecca's legal mind working through this new information and its implications for her arguments. Mom, where did these separate funds come from? I thought I understood your financial situation. You understood what I chose to share with you about my financial situation. I'm under no obligation to provide you with detailed accounting of my assets or investment strategies. But we're your children. We're supposed to help you make important decisions. We're supposed to protect you from mistakes that could jeopardize your future. Says who? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Says everyone. Says common sense. Says family responsibility. Rebecca, you're a lawyer. You know that competent adults have the right to make their own decisions, even decisions that others might consider unwise. You know that family relationships don't automatically grant authority over another person's choices. This isn't about legal authority, Mom. This is about love and concern and wanting what's best for you. Is it? Because from my perspective, it looks like frustration that I'm not behaving according to your expectations and plans. I could hear Rebecca taking deep breaths, trying to control her temper and find a more effective approach. Mom, please let me visit you today. Let me bring Michael and Linda so we can all sit down together and talk through this situation. Maybe there are aspects of the building purchase that we can help you optimize. Maybe there are family considerations that got overlooked in the excitement of making a big investment. You're welcome to visit, but understand that I'm not interested in having my decisions second-guessed or my competence questioned. If you want to have a conversation about our family relationship, I'm open to that. If you want to lecture me about my supposed limitations, you can save yourself the trip. Mom, that's not. I don't think you're incompetent. I think you're brilliant and capable. I just think that maybe you didn't have all the information you needed to make the best decision. What information did I lack? Well, for instance, did you know that Michael and I both live in that building? Did you consider how owning our home might affect our relationship? I laughed, genuinely amused by her question. Rebecca, of course I knew you lived there. That's precisely why I bought it. The silence that followed was profound. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. You bought our building on purpose? Because we live there? I bought your building because you thought you could manipulate me into giving up my home, and I wanted you to understand what it feels like to have your housing situation controlled by someone else's decisions. Mom, that's vindictive. That's not like you. Isn't it? How would you know what I'm like, Rebecca? When was the last time you had a real conversation with me about my thoughts, my feelings, my goals, my capabilities? When was the last time you treated me as an equal rather than a problem to be solved? She had no answer for that, because we both knew the truth. She hadn't seen me as a complete person in years, perhaps decades. I had been a role in her life rather than an individual with my own interests and autonomy. I'll expect you around 2:00, I said, ending the call before she could respond. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I attended the facility's Sunday religious service, not because I was particularly devout, but because I enjoyed the ritual and the sense of community. The pastor, a gentle man in his 50s, spoke about forgiveness and redemption, themes that seemed particularly relevant given the afternoon's upcoming conversation. But I wasn't ready for forgiveness yet. Rebecca and Michael needed to understand the depth of their disrespect before we could begin rebuilding our relationship on more equal terms. They needed to experience vulnerability and uncertainty before they could appreciate the security and autonomy they had taken for granted. At 2:00 precisely, I was sitting in the facility's family meeting room when Rebecca, Michael, and Linda arrived. They looked like a delegation of concerned relatives come to stage an intervention, which was probably exactly how they viewed this visit. Rebecca had chosen her outfit carefully, a soft sweater and casual slacks that suggested approachability rather than professional authority. Michael wore khakis and a button-down shirt, his weekend uniform for family obligations. Linda had selected a floral dress that was probably intended to project warmth and friendliness. They were trying to manage the optics of this conversation, to position themselves as loving family members rather than frustrated adversaries, but their body language betrayed their underlying tension and determination to regain control of the situation. Mom, Rebecca said, settling into the chair across from me. Thank you for letting us visit. We've been thinking a lot about yesterday's meeting, and we want to understand what you're trying to accomplish. I'm trying to accomplish respect for my autonomy and recognition of my competence, the same things any adult wants from their family members. Michael leaned forward, adopting the posture of someone prepared to engage in serious problem-solving. Mom, we've always respected you. We've always recognized your competence, but this situation is different. Buying our building feels like you're using business decisions to manipulate our personal relationship. Is that what it feels like, Michael? Interesting. Because when you pressured me to move out of my home, it felt like you were using personal relationships to manipulate my business decisions. Linda spoke for the first time, her voice carefully modulated to project reasonableness. Mrs. Chen, I think maybe there are some misunderstandings here that we could clear up if we all approach this conversation with open minds. I'm listening. Well, When Rebecca and Michael suggested that you might be happier at Sunset Manor, they weren't trying to control your life. They were genuinely worried about your safety and social engagement. Living alone in a large house can be isolating and potentially dangerous for anyone, regardless of age. Linda, did Rebecca and Michael consult with me about my social needs or safety concerns before they developed their plan for my housing situation? I'm not sure about the specific conversations you had. They didn't consult with me. They researched assisted living facilities, toured them without me, and presented me with a plan they'd already decided was best. They asked for my compliance, not my input. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Mom, we were trying to be helpful. We were trying to save you the stress of having to research all these options yourself. And I was trying to be helpful when I researched your building, identified its ownership problems, and purchased it to ensure it would be properly maintained and managed. I saved you the stress of wondering whether your new landlord would be responsible and responsive to residents' needs. The parallel was exact, and Rebecca had no response that wouldn't acknowledge the validity of my comparison. Michael tried a different approach. Mom, even if you're right about our approach being too controlling, don't you think buying our building is an extreme response? Don't you think there might have been less dramatic ways to make your point? Such as talking to us, explaining how our suggestions made you feel, asking us to involve you more in the decision-making process. I stared at him for a long moment, wondering if he truly didn't remember the kitchen conversation, where I had tried to express my concerns about their plans. Michael, I did try to talk to you. I told you I wasn't ready to leave my home. I asked questions about the necessity of the move. I expressed uncertainty about the timing. You and Rebecca dismissed my concerns and continued pressuring me to comply with your timeline. But you never said you felt manipulated or disrespected. You never explained that our approach was hurtful. I shouldn't have needed to explain that. You should have recognized that I deserved to be consulted about my own life decisions rather than simply informed about conclusions you'd reached without me. The conversation continued for another hour, covering the same ground repeatedly, as Rebecca and Michael searched for arguments that would convince me to reconsider my position. They offered to help me manage the building. They suggested I might be happier with a different investment strategy. They proposed family counseling to work through our communication issues. But underlying every suggestion was the same fundamental assumption: that I had made a mistake that needed to be corrected, that my decision-making was flawed, that they knew better than I did what was appropriate for my circumstances. They still didn't understand that the building purchase wasn't a mistake or an emotional reaction. It was a strategic decision designed to shift the balance of power in our relationship and force them to recognize my autonomy. When they finally left, promising to think about everything we've discussed, I felt both exhausted and satisfied. The conversation had confirmed that changing their attitude would require more than one dramatic revelation. It would require consistent demonstration of my competence and authority until they could no longer maintain their assumptions about my limitations. But I had time, I had resources, and most importantly, I had leverage. They needed me to be a reasonable landlord more than I needed them to be compliant tenants. The education of Rebecca and Michael Chen was just beginning. 3 months passed before Rebecca and Michael truly began to understand the permanence of their new reality. During those months, I established myself as a landlord who was both reasonable and uncompromising. I approved requests for apartment modifications when they were properly submitted through the management company. I responded promptly to maintenance concerns and building improvement suggestions. I even implemented several resident recommendations that enhanced the building's amenities and community atmosphere. But I also enforced every lease provision with absolute consistency. Late rent payments resulted in standardized penalty fees, regardless of the tenant's relationship to ownership. Noise complaints were investigated thoroughly and violators received formal warnings. Building policy violations were documented and addressed through proper channels, without exceptions or special consideration. Rebecca learned this lesson definitively when she hosted a dinner party that extended past the building's quiet hours policy. Other residents complained about noise from her apartment, and she received the same formal warning letter that any tenant would have received under similar circumstances. When she called to protest the treatment, explaining that she was the owner's daughter and the party had been a business networking event, I calmly informed her that family relationships didn't exempt anyone from lease obligations. Michael discovered my commitment to consistent policy enforcement when he requested permission to sublet his apartment for 3 months while he traveled for work. His lease explicitly prohibited subletting without written landlord approval, and his initial request was submitted informally through a text message to me personally rather than through the proper management channels. I responded by directing him to submit his request in writing to Gregory, who would review it according to standard procedures and building policies. The request was ultimately approved, but only after Michael provided all required documentation, references for his proposed subtenant, and additional security deposits specified in the lease agreement. He complained privately to Rebecca that I was treating him like a stranger, not understanding that I was actually treating him like a responsible adult tenant, rather than a child who could ignore rules because of his family connections. The transformation in my children's behavior was gradual but unmistakable. Their phone calls became more respectful, their requests more carefully worded. They stopped assuming I would automatically accommodate their preferences and began approaching me with the courtesy they would show any competent business professional. More importantly, they began asking about my life beyond my role as their landlord. Rebecca inquired about my activities at Sunset Manor, my friendships with other residents, my thoughts about books I was reading. Michael started sharing details about his work projects and asking for my opinions on decisions he was facing. These conversations felt different from our interactions during the years immediately following James's death. Instead of speaking to me like a dependent who needed their management, they spoke to me like an equal whose perspective had value. The change wasn't complete or consistently maintained. Old habits resurfaced occasionally, particularly when they were stressed or facing personal challenges. But the frequency of these lapses decreased as they internalized the new dynamics of our relationship. Harold observed these developments with the satisfaction of an engineer watching a system respond to properly applied adjustments. During our evening walks in the facility gardens, he would ask about my communications with Rebecca and Michael, analyzing their behavioral changes like data points in a long-term experiment. They're learning to see you as an independent agent, rather than a dependent variable, he noted one evening as we paused near the fountain that had become our traditional stopping point. The building ownership forced them to recognize your competence because they needed something from you that they couldn't obtain through manipulation. Do you think the lesson will stick once they've fully adjusted to the new normal? That depends on whether you maintain the conditions that created the change. If you ever revert to accepting their management or control, they'll probably revert to their previous assumptions about your capabilities. Harold's insight proved prescient during the 4th month of my building ownership, when Rebecca approached me with a proposal that tested both my resolve and my judgment. She had been offered a partnership position at her law firm, an opportunity that represented the culmination of years of dedicated work and professional achievement. The partnership required a significant financial investment, money that would come from her expected inheritance from my estate. "Mom," she said during one of our now regular weekly phone calls, "I want to talk to you about something important. I've been offered a partnership at the firm, which is incredible news, but it requires an upfront investment that I don't currently have available." I waited for her to continue, curious about how she would frame her request. "I know you haven't made any decisions about selling your house, and I'm not asking you to change your timeline for that. But I was wondering if you might consider a loan against the future sale proceeds. Something formal, with proper documentation and interest payments. Not a family favor, but a legitimate business transaction." The request was carefully constructed to respect the boundaries I had established while still seeking the financial assistance she needed. She wasn't demanding or assuming my agreement. She wasn't presenting her career needs as more important than my autonomy. She was asking for consideration of a business proposition. "Tell me more about the partnership terms and the investment requirements," I said. Rebecca provided detailed information about the law firm's structure, her proposed role, the expected returns on the partnership investment, and the timeline for repayment. She had prepared comprehensive financial projections and risk assessments. Most importantly, she had structured her request around my financial capacity rather than her emotional claims on my resources. "I'll need to review all the documentation and consult with my financial advisor," I told her. "If the terms are acceptable and the investment seems sound, I'm willing to consider a loan arrangement." "Really? You'd actually consider it?" "Rebecca, I've always wanted to support your professional success. What I objected to was being treated like an obstacle to your goals rather than a potential partner in achieving them." The loan was ultimately approved and structured through formal legal agreements that protected both of our interests. Rebecca received the funding she needed for her partnership investment, and I received a competitive return on a secured loan that would be repaid from her increased earnings over a 5-year period. More importantly, the transaction established a new pattern for our financial relationship. Instead of viewing my resources as inheritance they were entitled to claim, Rebecca and Michael began approaching me as a potential investor whose support needed to be earned through sound proposals and respectful negotiation. Michael applied this lesson 6 months later when he and Linda wanted to purchase a larger apartment in a different building. Instead of asking me to subsidize their down payment as a family favor, he presented a detailed proposal for a real estate investment partnership. I would purchase the apartment and rent it to them at below-market rates in exchange for their commitment to maintaining and improving the property. After 10 years, ownership would transfer to them in recognition of their sweat equity and reliable tenancy. The proposal demonstrated careful financial planning, realistic market analysis, and respect for my position as a businesswoman rather than simply a mother with assets they could access. It also offered me legitimate advantages, including diversification of my real estate portfolio and guaranteed rental income from reliable tenants. Both transactions succeeded because Rebecca and Michael had learned to approach me as a competent adult whose cooperation needed to be earned rather than assumed. They offered value in exchange for the assistance they requested. They structured their proposals around mutual benefit rather than one-sided obligation. The shift in our relationship extended beyond financial matters to the fundamental dynamics of family interaction. Rebecca began consulting me about major life decisions, seeking my perspective on career choices and personal relationships. Michael started sharing his struggles and uncertainties, asking for advice rather than simply reporting his accomplishments. These conversations felt like the kind of adult relationships I had hoped to have with my children, but had never quite achieved. During the years when they viewed me primarily as a caretaker, whose opinions were pleasant but not particularly relevant, the irony was not lost on me that I had needed to become their landlord before they could see me as their equal. A year after purchasing Harbor View Towers, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to move back to my house on Maple Street. Sunset Manor had served its purpose as a base of operations during my campaign to reclaim respect from my children. I had enjoyed the community, appreciated the staff, and valued the friendships I had developed with other residents. But the facility had always been a temporary solution rather than a permanent lifestyle choice. My house called to me with the voice of accumulated memories and deep-rooted identity. I missed the garden where I had planted flowers for 47 years. I missed the kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals for my family. I missed the front porch where James and I had shared quiet evenings watching the neighborhood change around us. I also missed the autonomy that came with controlling every aspect of my environment. Sunset Manor was comfortable and well managed, but it was still an institutional setting where my choices were constrained by group policies and communal considerations. Harold understood my decision completely. "You've proven what you needed to prove," he said when I told him about my plans. "You've established your competence and authority. Now you can choose your living situation based on your preferences rather than other people's assumptions about your limitations. What about you? Are you going to stay here indefinitely?" Harold smiled with an expression I had learned to recognize as his problem-solving look. "Actually, I've been developing my own exit strategy. I'm working with a group of residents to establish a cooperative living arrangement that would give us more independence while maintaining the social connections we've valued here." The idea was intriguing and characteristic of Harold's systematic approach to life challenges. Rather than simply accepting institutional care or returning to isolated single-family housing, he was creating a third option that addressed the genuine benefits of community living while preserving individual autonomy. My departure from Sunset Manor required several weeks of planning and coordination. I arranged for home care services to provide assistance with heavy cleaning and maintenance tasks, not because I couldn't manage these activities independently, but because I preferred to spend my time and energy on pursuits I found more interesting. I hired a landscaping service to restore the garden that had suffered from neglect during my absence. I contracted with painters and handymen to refresh the interior spaces and update some of the outdated fixtures. I reconnected with neighbors who had worried about my well-being during my time away. The house felt both familiar and new when I moved back in. The walls still held the echoes of family life, but I experienced them differently now. Instead of feeling like a keeper of memories, I felt like the creator of new possibilities. Rebecca and Michael helped me settle back into the house, carrying boxes and arranging furniture with the careful attention they had once devoted to moving me out. Their assistance felt different this time, offered rather than imposed, respectful rather than managing. "Are you sure you want to take on all this responsibility again?" Rebecca asked as we unpacked books in the living room. "The house is beautiful, but it's also a lot of work for someone living alone." "I'm sure," I replied. "And I'm not exactly living alone. I have neighbors, friends, regular visitors, and professional services for the tasks that are genuinely beyond my capabilities. I'm choosing independence, not isolation." Michael nodded approvingly. "That makes sense. And you're close enough to the city that we can visit regularly without it being a major trip." "You're welcome anytime," I told them both. "As long as you remember that you're visiting my home, not managing my life." The transition back to Maple Street marked the beginning of a new phase in our family relationship. Rebecca and Michael visited frequently, but their visits felt like social calls. Rather than welfare checks, they brought their children to play in the garden where they had once played. They joined me for holiday meals in the dining room, where we had shared countless family celebrations. Most importantly, they treated me like the family matriarch I had always been rather than the declining dependent they had briefly convinced themselves I was becoming. The building ownership continued to provide both financial returns and personal satisfaction. Harborview Towers thrived under my management, with low vacancy rates, satisfied tenants, and steadily appreciating property values. The renovations I had commissioned improved both the building's functionality and its market position. Rebecca and Michael remained model tenants, paying their rent promptly and treating building staff with respect. They never again attempted to leverage their family relationship for special treatment or exemptions from building policies. Gregory continued managing the day-to-day operations with professional competence and personal discretion. He never revealed to other tenants the family connections between ownership and certain residents, maintaining the business relationship I had established as separate from my personal relationships. The success of my real estate investment opened doors to other opportunities. Other property owners approached me about potential partnerships and acquisitions. Financial advisors sought my participation in investment pools and development projects. I had become known in local business circles as a serious investor whose judgment and resources could be valuable assets to various ventures. I accepted some of these opportunities and declined others, making decisions based on my own analysis and comfort level rather than others' expectations or recommendations. I was no longer the woman who deferred to her children's superior knowledge about financial matters. I was an experienced investor who consulted with professionals but made her own choices about risk and reward. 2 years after moving back to Maple Street, I received a visit that brought the entire experience full circle. Patricia Morrison, the social worker who had investigated the anonymous complaint about my treatment by Rebecca and Michael, came to see me at home. "Mrs. Chen," she said as we sat on the front porch where James and I had spent so many quiet evenings, "I wanted to follow up on the case I opened regarding your living situation. I understand you've moved back to your original." "Yes, I've been back for several months now. I'm very happy with my decision." "And your relationship with your children?" The person who filed the original complaint was concerned about potential manipulation or coercion regarding your housing decisions. "My relationship with my children has improved significantly. We've worked through our communication issues and established new patterns of interaction that respect everyone's autonomy and capabilities." Patricia smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose professional intervention had contributed to a positive outcome. "I'm glad to hear that. Elder abuse cases don't always resolve so successfully." "Actually, Patricia, I'm not sure this was ever really an elder abuse case. It was more a case of adult children who had lost sight of their mother's competence and autonomy. Sometimes families need outside pressure to recognize problematic dynamics." "Do you know who filed the original complaint?" "I do. And I'm grateful to that person for caring enough about my welfare to take action." Sometimes it takes a stranger's perspective to see clearly what family members miss. After Patricia left, I sat on the porch thinking about the journey that had brought me from displaced nursing home resident back to independent homeowner and successful businesswoman. The path had required more courage, determination, and strategic thinking than I had known I possessed. But it had also required the recognition that age and family relationships don't automatically diminish a person's right to self-determination. I had spent too many years accepting other people's assumptions about my limitations, deferring to their supposedly superior knowledge about what was best for me. The building purchase had been both a business investment and a personal declaration of independence. It had forced Rebecca and Michael to confront their misconceptions about my capabilities while providing me with concrete evidence of my competence. Most importantly, it had restored the balance of respect in our family relationships. I was no longer the declining parent who needed management. I was the family matriarch whose wisdom and resources contributed to everyone's well-being. As the sun set over the neighborhood where I had raised my children and built my life, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from reclaiming your own story. I had transformed from victim to victor, from dependent to decision-maker, from burden to benefactor. And I had done it all while maintaining the grace and dignity that James would have admired, and that my children had finally learned to appreciate. The woman who had stood silently in the care facility lobby while her children signed papers for her placement was gone. In her place was a woman who owned buildings, made investments, and commanded respect through demonstrated competence rather than demanded deference. Dorothy Chen had not just survived her children's attempt to control her life. She had turned it into the foundation for claiming the authority and recognition she had always deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.